Well, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Today, I'm going to get into a video for Core World History for Key Standard 6.4. So, the standard reads Students will explain the intellectual and artistic responses to global conflict and economic instability, such as conservatism, cubism, fascism, liberalism, self determination, socialism, and surrealism. Now, you've actually already read, if you've been in my class, Skyline High School, 2019 2020, you've actually read quite a lot about this. So, for example, fascism, pages 758 through 760 in your Glencoe World History book talks about that. You've also read quite a lot about, say, classical liberalism and some of the other ideologies and economic ideologies. So, like for instance, socialism, usually that's going to be when the government directs the economy, and you've read about, so for example, the Soviet Union a little bit already. You can, of course, reflect on some of all that. Today, though, I am going to focus on digging into liberalism and conservatism as political ideologies. And keep in mind, this is going to be stuff that sticks around to today. And something like liberal versus conservative doesn't always completely fulfill the situation. There's concerns about like how much control over people that the government should have, for instance, or social and economic freedom, which can be in opposition to each other, but don't necessarily have to be. And of course, any one individual can have beliefs that fit all over the place on this. But anyway, to dig into this, we're going to get into the Oxford book. It addresses some of this, the 2013 book by Dombrowski and the rest. Political perspectives in a liberal democracy compete within the framework of a constitution, free and fair elections, and peaceful transfer of power. The differing perspectives share a common belief in the rule of law and the need for social organization. They diverge, however, in their understanding of how society does function and how it should function. These political views are generally understood in terms of a spectrum of ideas and values, from left wing to right wing. The views left and right can be combined differently. An individual may lean to the right economically, but not socially, or an individual leaning towards the left may be concerned with economic issues, but give little attention within his priorities to, like, say, racism or women's issues. Moreover, the whole political leaning of a society can shift left or right at a particular historical moment or shift on specific issues. So, for example, women and the vote, initially an issue that was supported by the left, championed by Woodrow Wilson in the United States back in the period leading up to the amendment to the Constitution in 1920. Although what we give here is simplified, it provides an example of how perspectives are not just random opinions, but bodies of belief with their assumptions and values which influence how we see the world. Seeking knowledge with awareness of political perspectives demands conscious engagement. For the general public following the news within the social reality of any liberal democracy, there are some basic challenges. The need to follow news and views critically with an awareness of media leanings and the importance of alternative sources of information. The need to be informed as well as possible as voters on issues which are often complex and hotly contested, and the need to recognize the competing nature of political views such that many individuals and organizations give warped interpretations of opponents, their facts, and their views in order to look better themselves. Understanding is challenging, yes, but it's also fascinating. It could also be argued, as the Dombrowski text does, that seeking such understanding is significant to our own responsibilities as citizens within our societies. So, first for liberalism, or what we oftentimes call the left. Of greatest importance is collective well-being. All members of a society should share fairly in the commonwealth created by its social division of labor for the benefit of the society. The extent to which individuals can shape their lives is affected by initial positions of wealth, privilege, and power, gender, race, class, possession of citizenship, and so on. Through social programs to reduce exclusion and alienation and provide basic education and healthcare, a just society provides opportunities for all. In addition to internal infrastructure and national defense, government should take a social role for collective well-being. Government should administer programs of social inclusion and mitigate inequalities as a matter of social efficiency and fairness. Government should, in certain ways, regulate business to ensure that workers receive a fair wage and safe working conditions, and to minimize environmental harm, even when doing so compromises short-time profits of, say, corporations. Government should control public services and certain natural monopolies and resources according to the principles of social need and non-market criteria. Taxation, they tend to believe, should be progressive, taking a larger share from those who have accumulated more of the social wealth. Social control of private life should be kept to a minimum. Traditional values of the nuclear family and those of the society should accommodate, with a degree of flexibility, alternative models of marriage and family structure. Sexuality, gender roles, and childbearing, they believe, are private matters. Legislation should protect their rights. Considered to be in systematic opposition to ideal government, the wealthy who benefit unfairly from the work of others through unequal distribution of economic and political power, corporations which pursue profits above all. Considered to be allies of the liberalism movement, if not all in the same way or at the same time, are environmental groups, labor unions, poverty activists, feminist movements, multicultural and First Nations groups, non-governmental organizations, NGOs, about what we'll have to say a lot about coming up here later, organizations committed to such issues as liberal human rights, peace, and or social development. A saying that you could frequently hear from liberals: the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, potentially suggesting that social inequalities are problematic like that. To switch, conservatism, on the other side, of greatest importance is freedom of the individual. The common good should be achieved through maximizing the opportunities for individuals to benefit from their chosen pursuits. Individuals make choices freely and deserve their successes and failures. Those who take initiative and risk are entitled to their successes and are justly rewarded. Those who do not create opportunities for themselves are responsible for their own limited standard of living. Society as a whole has little responsibility to help them. Beyond basic internal infrastructure, national defense, and security, government has little role. Government should not take on large social programs. Individuals can give to social charities as a matter of personal choice if they would like to do so. Government should not interfere with the free market. It should not impose undue environmental regulation in order not to impede economic efficiency and growth within the capitalist system. Resources and public services should, for the most part, be owned and managed by private business according to principles of competition and profit maximization. Taxation should be kept to a minimum and should not penalize those who have been more financially successful. Social control of private life is necessary to uphold traditional values of the nuclear family and those of the society. Those who do not follow traditional values and models of relationships are under some circumstances considered immoral. Legislation should protect the ideal model of a family life. Considered to be systematic opposition to ideal government, free riders who benefit unfairly from the work of others through welfare systems, individuals and unions that impede production by protest rather than by adapting to the economic climate. Considered to be allies by the conservatives are, if not necessarily in the same way or at the same time, large businesses and corporations, the financial sector, some international economic institutions, frequently things like the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, or the International Monetary Fund, non-governmental organizations such as church groups, and those committed to family values and or entrepreneurship. Metaphors that are frequently used: a rising tide lifts all boats, or wealth trickles down, or something like that. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, that's our portion on liberalism and conservatism. Next, we're going to take a look at some artistic movements that developed in response to the challenges of the 19th and 20th century. We're going to look at Cubism, and we're going to look at Surrealism, for example. And by the way, much of the information is going to come out of Gardner's Art for the Ages. So the history of art is, of course, colored by the tensions of stylistic polarities within given eras, particularly the polarity of an intellectual versus an emotional approach to, say, painting. Earlier in my course, we saw this kind of back and forth waving pendulum thing as we were looking at the comparisons and contrasts to romanticism on the one hand and realism on the other. This is going to continue on until today, the history of painting especially. So Fauvism and German Expressionism came first and found their roots in Romanticism, the earlier ideology that we were talking about, and the emotional expressionistic work of Gauguin and Van Gogh. And by the way, my French accent is virtually non-existent, so I'm going to probably mispronounce a whole bunch of stuff in the names in the upcoming portion, but just try to deal with it. The second major art movement of the 20th century, Cubism, can trace its heritage to neoclassicism and the analytical and intellectual work of Cezanne. Cubism is an offspring of Cezanne's geometrization of nature and his abandonment of scientific perspective and his rendering of multiple views and his emphasis on the two-dimensional canvas surface. Picasso, the driving force behind the birth of Cubism and perhaps the most significant artist of the 20th century, combined the pictorial methods of Cezanne with formal elements from native African, Oceanic, and Iberian sculpture. Pablo Ruiz y Picasso was born in Spain, the son of an art teacher. As an adolescent, he enrolled in the Barcelona Academy of Art, where he quickly mastered the illusionistic techniques of the realistic academic style. By age 19, Picasso was off to Paris, where he remained for more than 40 years, introducing, influencing, or reflecting the many styles of modern French art. Picasso's first major artistic phase has been called his Blue Period. Spanning from the years 1901 to 1904, this work is characterized by an overall blue tonality, a distortion of the human body through elongations reminiscent of El Greco and Toulouse-Lautrec, and melancholy subjects consisting of poor and downtrodden individuals engaging in menial tasks or isolated in their loneliness. The old guitarist is but one of these haunting images. A contorted, white-haired man sits hunched over a guitar, consumed by the tones that emanate from what appears to be his only possession, apart from maybe just this rag that he's wearing. The eyes are sunken into the skeletal head, and the bones and tendons of his hungry frame protrude. We are struck by the ordinariness of poverty from the unfurnished room and the barren window view, Or is he on the curb outside? It doesn't seem to be very clear. To the uneventfulness of his activity and the insignificance of his plight. The monochromatic blue palette creates an unrelenting, somber mood. Tones of blue eerily echo the ghost like features of the guitarist. Picasso's blue period was followed by works that were lighter, both in palette and in spirit. Subjects from this so called rose period were drawn primarily from circus life and rendered in tones of pink. During this second period, which dates from 1905 to 1908, Picasso was inspired by two very different art styles. He, like many artists, viewed and was strongly influenced by the Cézanne retrospective exhibition held at the Salon d'Automne in 1907. At about that time, Picasso also became aware of the formal properties of ethnographic art from Africa, Oceania, and Iberia, which he viewed at the Musée de l'Homme. These two art forms, which at first glance might appear dissimilar, had in common a fragmentation, a distortion, and abstraction of form that were adopted by Picasso in works such as Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, this one here, one of the most famous of his pieces. This startling, innovative work, still primarily pink in tone, depicts five women from Barcelona's red light district. They line up for selection by a possible suitor who stands, as it were, in the position of the spectator. The faces of the three women are primitive masks. The facial features of the other two have been radically simplified by combining frontal and profile views. The thick-lidded eyes stare stage front, calling to mind some of the Mesopotamian votive sculptures from the earlier chapter of the book, chapter 13. The bodies of the women are fractured into geometric forms and set before a background of similarly splintered drapery. In treating the background and the foreground imagery in the same manner, Picasso collapses the space between the planes and asserts the two-dimensionality of the canvas surface in the manner of Cézanne. In some radical passages, such as the right leg of the leftmost figure, the limb takes on the qualities of drapery, masking the distinction between figure and ground. The extreme faceting of form, the use of multiple views, and the collapsing of space in Les Demoiselles together provided the springboard for analytic cubism, co-founded with the French painter Georges Braque in about 1910. The term cubism, like so many others, was coined by a hostile critic. In this case, the critic was responding to the predominance of geometrical forms in the works of Picasso and Braque. Cubism is a limited term in that it does not adequately describe the appearance of Cubist paintings, and it minimizes the intensity with which Cubist artists analyze their subject matter. It ignores the most significant contribution, a new treatment of pictorial space that hinged upon the rendering of objects from multiple and radically different views. The Cubist treatment of space differed significantly from that in use since the Renaissance. Instead of presenting an object from a single view, the Cubists, like Cézanne, realized that our visual comprehension of objects consists of many views that we perceive almost at once. They tried to render this visual information gathering in their compositions, in their dissection and reconstruction of imagery. They reassessed the notion that painting should produce the appearance of reality. Now, the very reality of appearances was being questioned. To Cubists, the most basic reality involved consolidating optical vignettes instead of reproducing fixed images with photographic accuracy. During the analytical phase of Cubism, which spanned the years from 1909 to 1912, the works of Picasso and Braque were very similar. The early work of Braque graduated from Impressionism to Fauvism to more structural compositions based on Cézanne. He met Picasso in 1907, and from then until about 1914, the artists worked together towards the same artistic goals. The theory of analytic cubism reached the peak of its expression in 1911 in works such as Braque's The Portuguesa, 1911. This one right here that is perhaps one of the most significant and most famous. Numerous planes intersect and congregate at the center of the canvas to form a barely perceptible triangular human figure, which is alternately constructed from and dissolved into the background. There are only a few concrete signs of its substance: dropped eyelids, a mustache, the circular opening of a stringed instrument. The multifaceted, abstracted form appears to shift position before our eyes, simulating the time lapse that would occur in the visual assimilation of multiple views. The structural lines, sometimes called the cubist grid, that define and fragment the figure are thick and dark. They contrast with the delicately modeled, short, choppy brushstrokes of the remainder of the composition. The monochromatic palette, chosen so as to not interfere with the exploration of form, consists of browns, tans, and ochres. Although the paintings of Picasso and Braque were almost identical at this time, Braque first began to insert words and numbers and to use trompe l'oeil effects in portions of his analytic cubist compositions. These realistic elements contrasted sharply with the abstraction of the major figures and reintroduced the nagging question like, what is reality and what is illusion in painting, something that persists throughout in the subject. Picasso and Braque did not stop with the inclusion of precisely printed words and numbers in their works. They began to add characters cut from newspapers and magazines, other pieces of paper, and found objects like labels from wine bottles, calling cards, theater tickets, even swaths of wallpaper and bits of rope. These items were pasted directly onto the canvas in a technique Picasso and Braque called papier collé, what we know as collage. The use of collage marked the beginning of the synthetic phase of Cubism. Some synthetic Cubist compositions, like Picasso's The Bottle of Suzette, are constructed entirely of found elements. In this work, newspaper clippings and opaque pieces of paper function as the shifting planes that hover around the aperitif label and define the bottle and the glass. These planes are held together by a sparse linear structure, much in the manner of analytic cubist works. In contrast to analytic cubism, however, the emphasis is on the form of the object and on constructing instead of disintegrating that form. Color re-entered the compositions, and much emphasis was placed on texture, design, and movement. After World War I, Picasso and Braque no longer worked together, and their styles, although often reflective of the Cubist experience they shared, came to differ markedly. Braque, who was severely wounded during World War I, went on to create a more delicate and lyrical still life compositions, abandoning the austerity of the early phases of Cubism. Although many of Picasso's later works carried forward the synthetic Cubist idiom, his artistic genius and versatility became evident after 1920, when he began to move in radically different directions. These new works were rendered in classical, expressionist, and surrealistic styles. When civil war gripped Spain, Picasso protested its brutality and inhumanity through highly emotional works such as Guernica. This mammoth mural, painted for the Spanish pavilion of the Paris International Exposition of 1937, broadcast to the world the carnage of the German bombings in civilian bombings of the Basque town called Guernica. The painting captures the event in gruesome details, such as the frenzied cry of one woman trapped in a rubble and fire, and the pale fright of another woman who tries in vain to flee the conflagration. A terrorized horse rears its head over a dismembered body, while an anguished mother embraces her dead child and wails futilely. Innocent lives are shattered into cubist planes that rush and intersect at myriad angles, distorting and fracturing the imagery. Confining himself to a palette of harsh blacks, grays, and whites, Picasso expressed, in his words, the brutality and darkness of the age. Surrealism began as a literary movement after World War I. Its adherents based their writings on the non rational, and thus they were naturally drawn to the Dadaists, another movement. Both literary groups engaged in automatic writing, in which the mind was to be purged of purposeful thought, and a series of free associations were then to be expressed with the pen. Words were not meant to denote their literal meanings, but to symbolize the often seething contents of the unconscious mind. Eventually, the Surrealist writers broke from the Dadaists, believing that the earlier movement was becoming too academic. Under the leadership of the poet André Breton, they defined their movement as follows in a 1924 manifesto. Surrealism. Noun, masculine. Pure psychic automatism, by which it is intended to express either verbally or in writing the true function of thought, thought dictated in the absence of all control exerted by reason and outside all aesthetic or moral preoccupations. Encyclopedia Philosophy. Surrealism is based on the belief in the superior reality of certain forms of association heretofore neglected, in the omnipotence of the dream, and in the disinterested play of thought. It leads to the permanent destruction of all other psychic mechanisms and to its substitution for them in the solution of the principal problems of life. From the beginning, Surrealism expounded two very different methods of working. One was illusionistic Surrealism, exemplified by artists like Salvador Dali and Yves Tanguy, rendered the irrational content, absurd juxtapositions, and metamorphoses of the dream state in a highly illusionistic manner. The other, called automatist surrealism, was a direct outgrowth of automatic writing and was used to divulge mysteries of the unconscious through abstraction. The automatist phase is typified by Joan Miro and Andre Masson. Modesty was not the strong suit of one man named Salvador Dali. One of the few household names in the history of art belongs to a surrealistic figure, him, Spaniard Salvador Dali, who lived from 1904 to 1986. His reputation for leading an unusual, one could say surrealistic life, would seem to precede his art because many people not familiar with his canvases had seen Dali's outrageous mustache and knew about his shenanigans. Once a guest on the Ed Sullivan television show, he threw open cans of paint at a huge canvas. Dali began his painting career, however, in a somewhat more conservative manner, adopting in turn Impressionist, Pointillist, and Futurist styles. Following these forays into contemporary styles, he sought academic training at the Academy of Fine Arts in Madrid. This experience steeped him in a tradition of illusionistic realism that he never really abandoned. In what may be his most famous canvas, The Persistence of Memory, the drama of the dreamlike imagery is enhanced by his trompe l'oeil technique. Here, in a barren landscape of incongruous forms, time, as all else, has expired. A watch is left crawling with insects like scavengers over carrion. Three other watches hang limp and useless over a rectangular block, a dead tree, and a lifeless, amorphous creature that bears a curious resemblance to Dali himself. The artist conveys the world of the dream, juxtaposing unrelated objects in an extraordinary situation but a haunting sense of reality threatens the line between perception and imagination. Dali's is, in the true definition of the term, a surreality, or reality above and beyond reality. Artists of this group, such as Joan Moreau, sought to eliminate all thought from their minds and then trace their brushes across the surfaces of the canvas. The organic shapes developed from intersecting skeins of line were believed to be unadulterated by conscious thought. Not all of the surrealists were interested in rendering their enigmatic personal dreams. Some found this highly introspective subject matter meaningless to the observer and sought a more universal form of expression. The automatist surrealists believed that the unconscious held such universal imagery, and through spontaneous or automatic writing or drawing, they attempted to reach it. Ladies and gentlemen, that's my presentation on Key Concept 6.4. The 6.5 will be coming up next week. Thank you.